Have you ever heard of war veterans suffering from PTSD, the psychological condition whose victims endure anxiety, guilt, and uncontrollable flashbacks from their warfare encounters?
This condition was extremely prevalent to Vietnam War veterans who struggled to readapt to society and let go of their experiences after the war.
Hello, and welcome to Get Lit, the book talk show where we open up both riveting reads and our minds. I'm your host, Nicole Terfloat.
And I'm your other host, Rachel Menke.
And this week we will be analyzing the theme of the chapter Field Trip from Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried.
In this chapter, the character Kathleen symbolizes the distance between Vietnam War veterans and civilians through the utilization of character, relationship, and setting.
Kathleen had just turned 10, and this trip was kind of a birthday present, showing her the world, offering her a piece of her father's history.
Here, Kathleen is described as a young, naive child, like all civilians who hadn't experienced war. It's pretty strange that Tim's birthday present to his little girl would be a trip to a past war zone. This demonstrates the theme of veterans coming home and how veterans could not wrap their minds around the fact that civilians didn't understand what they had been through. They had not experienced war.
Kathleen had seemed to enjoy the foreignness of it all, the exotic food and animals. The war was as remote to her as a caveman and dinosaurs.
Wow, did you hear that simile? Kathleen embodies the actions of civilians who would visit Vietnam, who have no personal connection with the war. They'd be all over the fun, light tourist vacation, but when it came to the serious history experiences, people would have a hard time understanding that a real bloody conflict had taken place there.
Some dumb thing happens a long time ago and you can't ever forget it. And that's bad? No, she said. That's weird.
Kathleen doesn't understand the purpose of their trip or its significance to Tim. He struggles with guilt and remembering the terrible deaths of his friends. She tries to belittle his experience because she has no guilt from the war. On this trip, O'Brien writes that he wanted signs of forgiveness or personal grace. Civilians had a hard time realizing that veterans saw death and blood and pain.
I pictured Kiowa's face, the way he used to smile. Behind me, Kathleen let out a giggle. The interpreter was showing her magic tricks. In the chapter Speaking of Courage, O'Brien writes, "Want to hear about the silver star I almost won?" Norman Bowker whispered, but none of the workmen looked up.
Both veterans, Tim and Norman Bowker, desperately wanted to share their dismal experiences with the people around them. However, the people around them were not there to witness these dreadful events. When your biggest problem is deciding what to buy at the supermarket, it's hard to imagine what it's like to see your best friend die gruesomely. Civilians' implicit refusals to listen juxtaposes the aching desire of the veterans to explain their emotional suffering.
In the bright sunlight, it was hard to picture what had happened on the ground some 20 years ago. No ghosts, just a flat, grassy field. The place was at peace. There were yellow butterflies. There was a breeze and a wide blue sky.
This is Tim's view of the field's landscape. The scenery is way different from what Tim remembers. Bright sunlight is a motif which repeats itself throughout the chapter. O'Brien uses this to contrast Tim's unit's experience at the field. In the chapter Speaking of Courage, where Norman Bowker describes how for a solid week the rains never stopped. Butterflies is mentioned again in the chapter. Butterflies are reminiscent of spring. Spring symbolizes new birth and renewal. Tim is a new, different person from the last time he was here. The butterflies indicate his letting go of his past to move on to a hopeful future.
I think this place stinks. It smells like, God, I don't even know what. It smells rotten.
Here we have Kathleen's view of the field, which totally contrasts with her father's. She has no idea what the significance of the field is, its history and its meaning to her father. Similarly, civilians would likely fail to understand its significance as well. Their views of the field range from a deep connection to a shallow disinterest. Kathleen has no memory of the field or the war, so the field has no significance to her.
The beach and waded into the lake without undressing. The water felt warm against his skin.
This excerpt comes from the chapter Speaking of Courage, where Norman Bowker wades into a lake in his hometown. This occurs after hours of driving in loops around the lake, reflecting on the death of his friend Kiowa.
I eased myself down, squatting at first, then sitting. There was again that sense of recognition. The water rose to mid-chest, a deep greenish brown, almost hot.
Here, Tim is describing his experience wading into the water where Kiowa was engulfed in mud. Both Tim and Norman's journey into the water is symbolic in that both men struggled after the war with the fact that they could not save their friend. By entering into the water, they are remembering how Kiowa was killed. This imitates how Kiowa died, by entering mud. O'Brien uses these similar situations to show that both Norman and Tim want to let go of Kiowa, the war, and the emotional burdens they carry. O'Brien shows that Tim is successful in this because later on, Tim releases Kiowa's moccasins into the water, thereby releasing the emotional weight of the war and cleansing Tim from the guilt that he feels about Kiowa's death. The water is an important part of the setting of each chapter because both settings symbolize the place where Kiowa drowned and the emotions that resulted from this event. Water is an archetype that signifies cleansing and rebirth. Both men go into the water to try to accomplish this cleansing. O'Brien makes it clear that Norman is not successful because he does not let go of his past, proven when, in the chapter Notes, Norman commits suicide.
Listen, this is stupid, she said. You can't even hardly get wet. How can you even swim out there?
In this excerpt, Kathleen is scrutinizing her father's actions because she doesn't understand the importance of the setting, water, to her father. Her limited knowledge of the war and the effects it had on her father make it impossible for her to empathize her dad's emotions and understand his actions. Like we said earlier, Tim had a major emotional release here. Kathleen's inability to comprehend this further exemplifies the distance between civilians and veterans. Tim finally puts his past behind him, proven at the end of the chapter when he tells Kathleen, "All that's finished."
Wow, it's hard to believe soldiers came home from the war and were so misunderstood by their friends and family. Next week, we'll discuss the climax of The Very Hungry Caterpillar. See you next week, folks.